Inspector Purbright, when everyone has a motive, who can you trust? BBC radio drama. The church fête at Flaxborough was one of those annual occurrences which managed to look both traditional and faintly desperate. The bunting, rather faded from several seasons of sun and rain, sagged from the trees like weary laundry. A brass band played with a determination that implied they had been coerced into attendance rather than invited. Children, encouraged by fond yet distracted parents, made desultory attempts at coconut-shy stalls while their elders hovered about the cake table, waiting to see if Mrs. Clegg's Victoria sponge would, as usual, achieve its record price at auction. Inspector Purbright, who had been persuaded by his wife to make an appearance, on the grounds that it was good for public relations, stood near the tea tent with a paper, cup of weak lemonade and the expression of a man conducting quiet reconnaissance rather than recreation. He was neither particularly fond of fêtes nor entirely indifferent to them. In his view, a gathering of townsfolk in one place was an excellent opportunity to observe human nature, and occasionally to anticipate trouble before it happened. The trouble, when it came, was so minor at first that no one quite believed it deserved the term. It began with a whisper passing through the crowd, which swelled into an audible ripple of dismay. Something had been stolen. Not money, nor jewellery, nor even the prized sponge. Instead, it was the trophy, a somewhat tarnished silver cup awarded each year to the winner of the best garden display. A symbol, perhaps more than a valuable object, but in Flaxborough symbolism was not to be underestimated. Mrs. Edith Prowse, a formidable widow with a voice like a foghorn and a sense of civic duty to match, was the first to make the matter public. "It's gone," she declared, standing near the display tent and glaring at those around her as if they were personally responsible. "The cup's been taken, and I distinctly saw it here not 20 minutes ago. Someone has sneaked in and stolen it right under our noses." This caused a flutter among the crowd, particularly among those who had been competing for the award. There was a small but intense rivalry between two gardeners in particular, Mr. Leonard Tewkesbury, who favoured extravagant floral arrangements, and Mrs. Vera Dimmock, who believed simplicity was the soul of beauty and was not above implying that Leonard's petunias were common in both variety and breeding. Both now looked equally indignant, though Vera's indignation seemed perhaps a touch too practised. Leonard, meanwhile, was wringing his hands and protesting his innocence with such vigour that it almost amounted to self-incrimination. Purbright observed them both with mild interest, saying nothing for the moment. The theft of a cup was hardly a police matter in the ordinary sense, but he had learned over the years that even the most trivial incident could serve as the first thread of a far larger and more tangled skein. The Reverend Crickley, vicar of St. Swithin's, and a man more accustomed to dealing with matters of the soul than missing silverware, approached Purbright with a face full of alarm. "Inspector," he said, clutching at his cassock, "I hardly know what to do. The Fête Committee entrusted me with the key to the trophy case. I only unlocked it to show the cup to a few of our more enthusiastic competitors." "And now this." Purbright nodded sympathetically. "Perhaps someone moved it for safekeeping." The Reverend's eyes widened behind his spectacles. "Safekeeping?" "Inspector, I've been here the whole time." "If someone moved it, they did so with remarkable stealth, and for reasons I cannot begin to fathom." Stir near the tea tent drew their attention. Mrs. Prowse had now gathered a small crowd and was recounting her discovery for the third time, each telling slightly more dramatic than the last. Words like brazen, scandalous, and unthinkable floated above the general hubbub. "Leonard was near the tent just before it went missing," Vera announced loudly, though without directly accusing him. "I dare say he knows more than he's saying." Leonard turned crimson. "I was fetching a saucer for Mrs. Blenkinsop's tea." "Ask her if you must know. Mrs. Blenkinsop." A frail lady with hearing difficulties nodded vaguely, which could have been agreement or merely an attempt to keep the peace. Purbright stepped forward at last, his tone calm and mildly curious rather than authoritative. "Now then," he said, "I'm sure there's no need for tempers. Reverend, perhaps we should simply have a quiet look around. The cup may yet turn up in some entirely innocent place." The search that followed was anything but quiet. Volunteers combed the tents, peered under tables, and even checked the hay bales near the children's petting zoo. Yet the cup remained stubbornly absent. The more it failed to appear, the more heated the accusations became. By the time the band played its final somewhat ragged march, the fête had dissolved into a mixture of suspicion and bad temper. As the crowd dispersed, Purbright lingered near the now empty display case. His gaze drifted to the ground beneath it, where a single, oddly shaped shoe print was barely visible in the trampled grass. It was not the footprint of any ordinary garden fête attendee. The heel was too narrow, the impression too precise. He said nothing to anyone, merely tucked the observation away for later consideration. In his experience, mysteries were rarely solved by dramatic revelations. They were unraveled by small, quiet details, like a missing trophy, a bitter rivalry, and an oddly shaped print no one else had noticed. As Purbright walked back toward the station, he reflected that in Flaxborough, the theft of a silver cup might well prove to be the least curious element of the day. By the next morning, the theft of the gardening cup had taken on proportions vastly exceeding its modest size and tarnished condition. The news had travelled down the high street with the speed and reliability of a well-greased bicycle chain, gathering embellishments and improbable theories as it went. What had begun as a simple statement of fact, "The trophy has gone missing," was now recounted in elaborate detail, with villains conjured out of nothing more than personal dislike and circumstantial presence. At the post office, Mrs. Violet Binns leaned over the counter as she spoke to her cousin, who was waiting to purchase stamps. "It's no ordinary theft," she confided, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent the next customer from overhearing. "I heard from Doris, Doris, who helps at the library, that the lock was forced with a skeleton key. And she says, mind you, that the thief wore gloves, proper burglar gloves, so as not to leave prints. Sounds like someone who knew what they were about, if you ask me." Her cousin, suitably impressed, nodded gravely. "And who would go to all that trouble for a cup?" "Unless it were symbolic." Violet's eyes gleamed. "Exactly, which is why I think it's to do with that business between Leonard Tewkesbury and Mrs. Dimmock. Everyone knows she accused him of using fertilizer from questionable sources. Meanwhile, at the hairdresser's, Mrs. Prowse was recounting her own role in the affair for what was certainly not the first time. The audience, consisting of 3 ladies under dryers and a stylist with a penchant for gossip, listened with rapt attention. Each retelling grew a shade more dramatic, until Mrs. Prowse's discovery sounded almost like a heroic intervention. She now claimed to have sensed something amiss even before noticing the cup's absence. "I simply knew, deep down, that something wasn't right," she said, placing a hand dramatically upon her ample bosom. "And sure enough, when I looked, gone, vanished. It's as though the very earth swallowed it up. I do hope Inspector Purbright is taking this seriously." "Inspector Purbright always takes things seriously," said the stylist, whose faith in the constabulary was unshakable, provided it led to interesting developments. "But between you and me, I hear he has his eye on Leonard. Saw him loitering near the display tent myself, and I thought, that man's up to something." Across town at the snug of the Fox and Hounds, a different theory was gaining ground among the men nursing their midday pints. "Mark my words," declared Mr. Sidney Harrow, who considered himself the possessor of rare insight. "This wasn't about flowers or gardening pride. This was a message. Could be connected to the allotment dispute, eh? You all remember when the council tried to increase the fees last year? Plenty of folks said they'd never forgive 'em. His drinking companion, Mr. Digby Lummis, nodded with slow deliberation. "Aye, but smashing a window or painting slogans is one thing. Stealing the cup, that takes nerve." and a good pair of legs. Whoever did it must have slipped past a fair few pairs of eyes. The Reverend Crickley, poor man, found himself besieged by questions whenever he ventured out to fetch groceries or visit parishioners. Each inquisitor seemed to think he held back crucial information, perhaps even the identity of the culprit. The truth was he had very little to tell, other than the deeply mortifying admission that the theft had occurred under his watch. Inspector Purbright, for his part, remained an island of calm amid this rising tide of speculation. He spent the morning walking quietly through the town, pausing here and there to exchange polite greetings, appearing to be nothing more than a genial presence. In reality, he was listening with great care, filing away each overheard word, each glance, each little inconsistency. When he stopped at Mrs. Blenkinsop's modest cottage, she answered the door, looking slightly bewildered but eager to help.
"Oh, Inspector," she said, cupping a hand to her ear. "Is this about the fête?"
Such a dreadful business, though I can't quite see why everyone's in such a state. It's only a cup after all. Indeed, Mrs. Blenkinsop, Purbright replied gently. But sometimes small matters can lead us to understand larger ones. You saw Mr. Tewkesbury fetch a saucer yesterday, I believe? She blinked. Did I?
"Well, yes, I think so."
Or perhaps it was Mrs. Prowse who fetched it. It's all a bit muddled now, her brow furrowed in concentration, though I do remember hearing a sharp clinking noise like metal striking wood.
That was just before everyone started shouting. Purbright thanked her and moved on, not pressing her further.
Memories were like delicate glass. Push too hard, and they shattered into useless fragments. By afternoon, the gossip had reached such a fever pitch that the very air seemed charged with suspicion. Shopkeepers exchanged knowing looks when certain customers entered. Long-time friends found themselves speaking carefully, measuring their words as though a single slip might bring accusations upon them. Even the children, sensing the tension, invented elaborate games in which they chased imaginary thieves across the village green. At the police station, Sergeant Malley reported a curious development. 3 separate anonymous notes had been delivered through the front door in the space of an hour, each accusing a different person of the theft. One pointed a finger at Leonard Tewkesbury, another at Mrs. Dimmock, and the third, somewhat surprisingly, at Reverend Crickley himself. Purbright read them in silence, his expression betraying no hint of amusement or irritation. He folded the papers neatly and placed them in a folder. "It seems," he remarked dryly, "that we now have more suspects than there are actual inhabitants of Flaxborough." The sergeant grunted. "Lot of mischief makers about, sir?" "Or," Purbright said, gazing thoughtfully at the folder, "one mischief maker with a very particular purpose." As dusk settled over the town, lights twinkled on in windows, and the streets grew quiet once more. But beneath that tranquil surface, a current of unease ran strong. Somewhere among the good people of Flaxborough, someone knew the truth, and was determined to keep it hidden, even if that meant stirring the pot of rumour until no one could see clearly at all. Purbright, standing at his office window, allowed himself a faint smile. The town might be buzzing like an overturned beehive, but to his mind, the real game had only just begun. Inspector Purbright began his day with deliberate slowness, not from idleness, but from strategy. It was his view that haste frightened truth into hiding. Over a modest breakfast of boiled egg and toast, he considered his next steps, mentally arranging the names and faces gathered from the previous day's fête and the subsequent deluge of gossip. There was no shortage of suspects nor of motives, but abundance was not clarity. By mid-morning, he set out along the cobbled high street, his hat tipped politely to passers-by. His first visit was to Leonard Tewkesbury, who lived in a narrow, fastidiously tidy house near the railway line. Leonard answered the door, looking as if he had spent a sleepless night. His hands, Purbright noticed, were spotless, but trembled slightly as they fussed with the doorknob. "Good morning, Mr. Tewkesbury," Purbright said, his tone mild, almost conversational.
I thought I might trouble you for a word or two about yesterday's unfortunate business. Leonard attempted a smile that faltered halfway.
Oh, yes, Inspector, of course.
Come in, do. Shocking affair, wasn't it?
A disgrace to the whole town. The interior of the house reflected its owner's character. Everything neat, everything labelled, every cushion aligned with geometric precision. Purbright's gaze swept across a windowsill crowded with miniature watering cans and ceramic garden gnomes before settling on Leonard, who had perched anxiously on the edge of an armchair. "You were near the display tent shortly before the disappearance of the cup," Purbright said.
Phrasing it as a statement rather than an accusation. Yes, Leonard replied quickly.
"But only to fetch a saucer for Mrs. Blenkinsop's tea. The poor dear can't manage a cup without one, you know." "She confirmed it, I believe." Purbright nodded slowly, allowing silence to stretch just long enough to unsettle. "Quite so. And you didn't notice anyone else lingering about?" Leonard hesitated, moistening his lips. "Well, Vera Dimmock was there, naturally."
Hovering, she was, always watching, as if expecting me to put a foot wrong. His voice sharpened.
"She's never forgiven me for winning last year's cup, you know." Purbright made a non-committal sound and rose to leave. "Thank you, Mr. Tewkesbury. Most helpful." His calm politeness left Leonard looking faintly deflated,
as though he had expected either a reprieve or an accusation, and had received neither. From there,
Purbright strolled to Vera Dimmock's cottage, where the scent of potpourri nearly overwhelmed him upon entry. Vera, a plump woman with a shrewd gaze, greeted him warmly, too warmly perhaps. "Inspector? Do come in. I suppose this is about that dreadful theft." Purbright inclined his head. "I should like to hear your recollections of yesterday, Mrs. Dimmock." Vera clasped her hands together dramatically. "Well, as I told several people already, I was tending my roses when the excitement began. Leonard was hanging about the tent, muttering to himself, looking terribly agitated. I thought, that man's up to mischief." She paused, gauging Purbright's reaction. "Indeed," Purbright murmured, his expression unreadable. "Did you happen to see the Reverend at any point?" Vera's eyebrows shot up. "The Reverend? Why, no. He seemed to vanish once he opened that case. Most irresponsible, if you ask me. Perhaps he was distracted, or avoiding blame." Purbright allowed the remark to hang in the air before thanking her and departing. As he walked back toward the town square, he reflected on how easily suspicion shifted shape, like smoke in a draught. Each person's account was coloured not by observation, but by long-held grievances. His next stop was the Fox and Hounds. The snug was nearly empty at this hour, save for Sidney Harrow polishing glasses behind the bar. Sidney greeted Purbright with the eager deference of a man who both feared and admired authority. "Morning, Inspector."
Terrible goings-on, what?
"Quite," Purbright said mildly. "Tell me, Mr. Harrow, did you notice anyone leaving the fête unusually early yesterday?" Sidney frowned in thought. "Now you mention it, young Arthur Prowse slipped off right quick, barely touched his pint when he came in here after. Looked flustered, he did." "But then he's always flustered," Purbright smiled faintly.
And did he say anything about the fate?
"Only muttered about how some people didn't deserve their gardens, whatever that meant." Sidney leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Between us, Inspector, Arthur's been in a bit of a state lately.
Arguments with his mother, money troubles."
That sort of thing." Purbright filed this away without comment and made his way to St. Swithin's, where he found Reverend Crickley rearranging hymn books with distracted fervour. "Inspector?" the Reverend said, visibly startled.
"You gave me quite a fright." "My apologies. I merely wish to confirm you were near the trophy case shortly before it was opened." Yes.
"I unlocked it myself. But then Mrs. Prowse called me over to adjudicate a dispute about the jam competition, and when I returned, well, you know the rest." The Reverend sighed deeply. "I can scarcely believe it happened." Purbright regarded him steadily. "Locks, Reverend, are curious things. Sometimes they tell us as much as those who hold the keys." Crickley blinked, uncertain how to respond. By the time he gathered his thoughts, Purbright was already at the door, leaving behind a trail of quiet unease. As evening fell, Purbright returned to the station. Sergeant Malley awaited him with a notebook full of reports. "Quite the day, sir. Every man and his dog's been in to give a statement." Purbright removed his hat and sat at his desk, his face betraying no weariness. "Statements are like seeds, Sergeant. Some sprout truth, others weeds. It is our task to discern which is which." Malley gave a puzzled grunt.
"And do you think we've got the truth yet?"
Purbright's gaze drifted to the folder containing the anonymous notes. "Not yet," he said softly. "But we've certainly acquired a fine collection of weeds." He leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together, and allowed himself a small, inward smile. The garden of deception was flourishing, and he had only just begun to tend it. By the following morning, the whispers that had once fluttered around town like stray feathers began to coalesce into something more solid. The name of Councillor Horace Greaves. He was, by common agreement, a man of consequence, though how much consequence precisely depended on whether one owed him a favour or a grudge. Horace had chaired the Fête Committee for the past 3 years, a role he treated with the gravitas of a cabinet post. It was, therefore, perhaps inevitable that blame would find its way to his door once people had tired of flinging it in all other directions. Inspector Purbright, never one to ignore the prevailing breeze, paid a call on Horace's residence, a sprawling Edwardian villa that seemed slightly too large for its owner, much like a coat worn by someone hoping to appear broader than they were. Horace himself met the inspector at the door, resplendent in a silk dressing gown of deep maroon. He looked not so much surprised by Purbright's visit as mildly inconvenienced, like a man interrupted mid-thought about his next self-congratulatory speech. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head with a formality that teetered on the edge of condescension. "Do come in."
"I assume this is about the unfortunate incident at the fair."
"Tragic business, tragic." Purbright stepped inside, his eyes noting the decor, heavy drapes, overstuffed chairs, and a mantelpiece crowded with trophies of various sorts. Some were clearly athletic, others for public service, and 1 or 2 seemed awarded simply for being Horace Greaves. "Yes," Purbright said mildly. "I should like to clarify a few matters. If you've no objection." "None whatsoever." Horace led him to the drawing room and gestured towards a chair. "I do hope you're getting closer to resolving this nonsense. The town is in quite a state, and I've been doing my utmost to restore calm." Purbright settled himself, folding his hands in his lap. "You've been very active in that regard, I hear." Horace allowed himself a modest chuckle. "Well, one does what one can. I've already offered to donate funds for a replacement trophy. It's not the same, of course, but we must think of appearances." Purbright regarded him thoughtfully. "Generous of you." "Not at all," Horace said, waving a hand. "The prestige of the fête must be preserved.
"We cannot allow this
act of mischief to tarnish our traditions." Purbright let the words hang for a moment before speaking again, his tone conversational. "I understand you had access to the key for the trophy case." Horace stiffened, though he recovered quickly. "As chairman, yes, but I entrusted it to Reverend Crickley on the day itself. I considered it a symbolic gesture, placing the matter in the hands of the church, so to speak. Besides," he added, leaning forward with sudden earnestness, "I was far too busy overseeing the raffle and greeting the mayor to trouble myself with such details." Purbright inclined his head. "Of course. Still, some have remarked upon your presence near the display tent shortly before the discovery of the theft." Horace's laugh was a shade too loud.
"Naturally I was near it, Inspector. I was everywhere."
"It's my duty to circulate, to ensure that every stallholder feels appreciated. Goodness me, must a chairman be accused simply for doing his job?" Purbright's expression remained calm and unreadable. "I merely seek to establish facts, Mr. Greaves. Facts are often less dramatic than rumour." Horace settled back, mollified but not entirely at ease. "Then allow me to assure you, Inspector, that I had neither time nor inclination to commit so petty a crime. Why would I steal a trophy only to offer to replace it? It would be absurd. Purbright rose, offering a polite nod. Indeed, it would seem so. As he departed, he noted the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in the hall, mingling oddly with the smell of polished wood. It was a small detail, but Purbright filed it away. Later, back at the station, Sergeant Malley awaited him with fresh tidings.
So you'll want to hear this. Mr. Greaves has been the talk of the town all morning.
Apparently he was overheard at the fête, saying the cup belonged to the right sort of people. Folks are taking it to mean he didn't fancy Mrs. Dimmock winning again. Purbright's brows lifted slightly. And who reported this remark? Malley consulted his notes. Mrs. Prowse. She claimed she heard it herself while she was passing by. Purbright's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Mrs. Prowse hears many things. Still, such a statement does make an impression. As the afternoon wore on, a pattern began to emerge. The anonymous notes, the casual remarks repeated through several layers of interpretation, the eager way townsfolk seized upon the idea of Horace Greaves as culprit. All of it formed a picture almost too neat. It was as though someone were carefully arranging pieces on a board, nudging them toward a particular conclusion. That conclusion was further encouraged when Leonard Tewkesbury appeared at the station, flushed with indignation.
I've just come from the grocer's, he declared, and everyone there is saying Horace must have taken the cup.
They say he wanted to keep it out of Vera Dimmock's hands because she refused to contribute to his precious raffle fund.
Inspector, surely this proves... Purbright held up a hand, silencing him gently.
It proves only that people enjoy a theory, Mr. Tewkesbury. The truth, however, is rarely decided by popular vote. Leonard subsided, muttering darkly. When he had gone, Malley leaned close.
Do you think Horace did it, sir?
Purbright considered the question for a long moment. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted through the station window, casting long bars of light across the desk. No, he said finally, his voice soft but certain.
He's too eager to appear above suspicion.
That kind of eagerness often comes not from guilt, but from fear of being misunderstood, Malley frowned. Then why is everyone so set on blaming him? Purbright's gaze drifted toward the folder of notes once more. Because, Sergeant, it is sometimes easier to follow a trail that has been laid out for you than to wonder who laid it. And with that, he returned to his paperwork, leaving the question of who truly benefited from Horace Greaves's apparent generosity to linger, unresolved and troubling. The evening of that same day brought with it a mist that drifted lazily from the river, softening the outlines of shop fronts and lampposts, as though the town itself wished to blur its features and avoid recognition. Inspector Purbright, however, had no patience for haze, literal or otherwise. After the matter of Councillor Greaves had been put aside for the moment, he turned his attention to a less obvious, but naggingly persistent puzzle, the missing cup's actual disappearance. Rumour and theory were plentiful, but tangible evidence was scarce. Indeed, apart from the faintly unusual shoeprint he had noticed on the day of the fête, Purbright's pockets were depressingly empty of clues. That changed, curiously enough, thanks to a complaint from Mrs. Prowse, who telephoned the station just as Purbright was preparing to leave for the evening. "Inspector," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut paper, "someone has trampled my flower beds." "My flower beds, Inspector?"
As if this town has not suffered enough indignity. Purbright promised to come by directly, though not with the urgency Mrs. Prowse clearly believed warranted.
When he arrived at her house on the edge of the green, he found her standing amid the wreckage of tulips and marigolds, one hand raised dramatically like a tragic heroine in a parish play. "Look at it, just look at it," she cried, all flattened, as though a herd of wild pigs came charging through. "And don't think this isn't connected to that dreadful theft. Mark my words, it's part of the same scheme." Purbright bent down, not to inspect the flowers, but to examine the narrow path between the beds. His sharp eye caught a small object half hidden in the damp soil. He retrieved it carefully, brushing away mud to reveal a single, rather distinctive button. It was large, covered in dark green fabric, and stamped with a barely discernible crest. "Is this yours, Mrs. Prowse?" he asked mildly. She peered at it.
"Mine? Certainly not."
"I've never owned anything so peculiar. It looks like the sort of thing a military man might wear, or one of those theatrical types from the town hall plays."
"Not that I'm implying anything, of course." Purbright tucked the button into his pocket without comment.
While Mrs. Prowse continued her lamentations, he cast his gaze over the trampled area. The pattern of damage suggested someone had not merely stumbled through in haste, but had paused, doubled back, and paused again. It was purposeful movement, someone seeking or hiding something. Back at the station, Purbright examined the button under the brighter desk lamp. The crest, now more visible, was of a stylized, rampant lion encircled by a wreath. It was not a common emblem. He considered the garments of those he had seen at the fête, and after a moment recalled only one coat that matched such a detail. The following morning, Purbright set out early, heading for the small tailoring shop run by old Mr. Pevensey. If anyone in Flaxborough could identify a button's origins, it was Pevensey, who had fitted half the town for suits over the past 30 years. Pevensey examined the button with grave concentration, adjusting his spectacles.
"Ah, yes.
This comes from a rather unusual coat.
I made only 2 in this particular style.
Military cut, special order, dark green broadcloth. Not many folk would wear it these days. Out of fashion, you see. 2, you say?" Purbright's tone remained neutral. Pevensey nodded. "One for Major Lapping, the retired gentleman over by the river, and another for young Arthur Prowse, Mrs. Prowse's son. Though why a lad like him wanted such a coat, I couldn't say. He insisted on it, though. Even paid in advance, which is rare enough to remark upon." Purbright thanked him and left, his mind ticking over this new information. Major Lapping was a man of orderly habits and well-known routines. Arthur, by contrast, was volatile, as Sidney Harrow had mentioned. The image of Arthur leaving the Fox and Hounds flustered, and muttering now took on a sharper edge. Later that afternoon, Purbright contrived to encounter Arthur near the green. The young man started visibly at the sight of the inspector, then attempted a smile that wavered like a flag in a weak breeze. "Good afternoon, Arthur," Purbright said pleasantly. "Out for a stroll?" Arthur nodded quickly.
"Yes, sir."
"Just, getting some air."
After all the excitement, Purbright's gaze dropped, seemingly idly, to Arthur's coat.
It was indeed dark green, though the buttons were plain, utilitarian things. That, in itself, was telling. "Strange business, the fête," Purbright remarked. "So many people coming and going, it's difficult to keep track."
"I imagine you were near the display tent at some point."
Arthur swallowed hard. "Only for a minute."
I didn't see anything unusual," Purbright smiled kindly.
"Of course. By the way, I believe one of your buttons may have come loose. Would you mind terribly if I compared it to one I found yesterday?" Arthur's face drained of colour.
I don't think that's necessary."
"Must be someone else's." Purbright produced the button with a magician's flourish. "This is quite a distinctive item, you see."
"Hard to mistake." Arthur's lips parted, but no words emerged.
He glanced around wildly, as though seeking an escape route that existed only in his imagination. Then, with a muttered excuse, he bolted, leaving Purbright watching him with calm interest. When Purbright returned to the station, Mally was waiting.
Puzzled by the inspector's apparent satisfaction. "Was it important, sir?"
"Just a button?" Purbright placed the object carefully on his desk. "Buttons, Sergeant, are curious things. They fasten what might otherwise fall apart. Sometimes they do the same for lies," Mally frowned. "So Arthur's our man, then?" "Perhaps," Purbright said, gazing thoughtfully out the window. "Or perhaps someone wishes us to believe he is."
"A button out of place can be a clue."
"Or a deliberate distraction. The challenge lies in knowing which." As dusk fell once more over Flaxborough, Purbright's mind turned not to the button itself, but to the hands that might have arranged for him to find it. The puzzle had deepened, and the missing cup was beginning to seem less important than the silent game being played behind it. The parish hall, usually a place of tepid tea and earnest committee meetings, had been pressed into service as the venue for a hastily arranged gathering. Ostensibly, it was to discuss the upcoming harvest festival, but the unspoken purpose was to air grievances and perhaps to sniff out culprits under the guise of civic duty. Inspector Purbright attended at Reverend Crickley's polite request, though he suspected the invitation was more about giving the townsfolk a focus for their speculation than any genuine need for police presence. By the time Purbright arrived, the hall was already warm with the combined breath of its occupants. Wooden chairs scraped across the worn floor as people shuffled about, forming cliques of mutual distrust. Mrs. Prowse sat in the front row like a queen upon her throne, her sharp eyes scanning the room for signs of impropriety. Vera Dimmock and Leonard Tewkesbury occupied opposite corners, each with their own retinue of supporters, while Horace Greaves loomed near the refreshment table, projecting an air of authority he clearly hoped would be contagious. Purbright took a seat at the back, unobtrusive but attentive. He had learned long ago that the less he inserted himself into such gatherings, the more people revealed without realizing it. The meeting began with Reverend Crickley's attempt at solemnity, though his voice trembled with nerves. "We are gathered here," he began, "to ensure that our town's spirit remains unshaken by recent
events." A ripple of murmurs greeted this understatement. Mrs. Prowse stood abruptly, cutting him off.
"With respect, Reverend, the spirit of this town is already bruised, if not battered. A theft at our fête, vandalism of my garden, and now rumours spreading like wildfire. We cannot simply carry on as though nothing has happened." Vera Dimmock sniffed loudly. "Some of us think the real damage comes from all this finger-pointing. Perhaps if people minded their own affairs." Leonard shot to his feet.
"Are you implying I'm to blame, Vera?"
"Because if you are, you'd better say it outright instead of hiding behind insinuations." Horace Greaves raised both hands in a theatrical gesture of calm.
"Please let us keep our tempers."
"I propose we focus on constructive solutions. For instance, I've already offered to fund a replacement trophy. Surely that proves my commitment to our shared traditions." A muttered chorus of half-hearted approval followed, though one or two voices grumbled about buying absolution. Purbright noticed Arthur Prowse slinking into the hall late, avoiding his mother's gaze. The young man's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously. He took a seat near the back, 2 rows away from the inspector, and sat hunched, as if hoping to melt into the woodwork. As the meeting meandered, the conversation began to stray from practical matters into well-trodden grudges. Old disputes, long buried under polite smiles, resurfaced like weeds after rain. Mrs. Prowse accused the council of mismanaging fête funds, citing a discrepancy in last year's accounts. Horace responded with wounded dignity, claiming the missing sum had been spent on essential improvements, though he grew vague when pressed for details. Vera, emboldened by the murmurs of discontent, brought up an incident from 3 years prior when Leonard had supposedly sabotaged her prize-winning chrysanthemums. Leonard, spluttering with rage, denied it, countering with a story about Vera's underhanded tactics involving borrowed compost and a mysteriously absent judging form. Through it all, Purbright sat motionless, his gaze moving from face to face. The patterns were becoming clearer. What had seemed at first a simple case of theft now spread outward, touching on money, pride, and ancient rivalries. Each participant had something to lose or gain, depending on how the mystery was resolved. At one point, Sidney Harrow, who had slipped in unnoticed, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," he said, "but there's been talk down at the pub about the allotments. Some folks reckon this whole business started when the council tried to raise fees." "Could be someone's way of making a point," Horace scowled.
"Utter nonsense."
"The council's decisions are entirely above board." "Maybe so," Sidney replied mildly, "but not everyone sees it that way. Remember when old Mr. Galloway's plot got taken away for unpaid dues? Some say he never forgave you, councillor." Horace shifted uncomfortably, his carefully composed facade showing a hairline crack. Purbright noted the reaction, storing it away with the precision of a clerk filing papers. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere thickened. Even the Reverend's attempts at peacemaking grew sharper, his own patience wearing thin. When Mrs. Prowse finally declared that the fate's honour had been dragged through the mud like a common turnip, half the room laughed while the other half gasped. Purbright rose quietly, drawing no attention, and slipped outside into the cool night air. From the steps of the hall, he could still hear the muted clamour within. It sounded less like a community meeting than the opening skirmish of a battle. Arthur emerged a moment later, looking furtive. Purbright fell into step beside him with casual ease. "Late night, Arthur," he remarked conversationally. Arthur flinched.
"Yes, sir. I was just heading home." "Understandable," Purbright said. "Crowded room, lots of opinions. Hard to know where to stand." Arthur gave a jerky nod, but offered nothing more.
Purbright let the silence stretch, then added softly, "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't standing, but keeping balance when others are pushing." Arthur glanced at him, startled, then hurried off without a word. Purbright watched him go, thoughtful. The young man was clearly entangled in matters far beyond a missing trophy. But so, it seemed, was half the town. As he walked back toward the station, Purbright reflected on the evening's revelations. The theft, the vandalism, the rumours, they were no longer isolated events. They were threads in a tapestry woven from years of jealousy, ambition, and quiet malice. And like any tapestry, it could only be understood by stepping back far enough to see the whole picture. For now, though, Purbright would content himself with gathering threads. Even if they led deeper into shadows, he suspected some would rather leave untouched. The following morning broke with a brittle kind of clarity. The mist burned away by a pale autumn sun that made the cobblestones glisten as though freshly polished. It was the sort of day that might have seemed wholesome, even hopeful, had the air not been heavy with unresolved tensions from the night before. Inspector Purbright, seated at his desk with a cup of tea gone cold beside him, was reviewing his notes when the station telephone rang with an urgency that made Sergeant Malley startle so violently he nearly upset the ink pot. Purbright answered with his usual unhurried calm, listening without comment to the voice on the other end. His eyes narrowed slightly as he murmured a few measured replies, then he replaced the receiver with deliberate care. "That was Dr. Hoverton," he said, rising. "There's been an accident down by the Mill Road. Arthur Prowse has been found injured." Gravely injured, Malley blinked.
"Arthur, the lad with the coat buttons?" "The very same." Purbright retrieved his hat.
"He was discovered at the foot of the embankment near the old quarry."
"It seems he fell."
Or was helped to fall. The two men drove out at once, the police car rattling along the uneven road. As they approached the scene, Purbright noted the gathering crowd, a knot of villagers craning their necks for a better view. The sight of Mrs. Prowse, standing rigidly at the roadside, her face ashen and set in grim lines, suggested that news had travelled with its usual speed. Arthur lay on a stretcher attended by Dr. Hoverton and a pair of orderlies. His coat was torn, his face bloodied, and his breathing shallow but steady. The doctor looked up as Purbright arrived. "He'll live, but only just," Hoverton said curtly. "Head trauma, broken ribs. Whatever happened, he took quite a tumble." Purbright crouched beside the young man, observing the angle of his limbs, the pattern of scratches on his hands. "Can he speak?" "Not coherently. He came round briefly and muttered something about being pushed, but it was unclear whether he meant literally or figuratively." The doctor shook his head. "I'll be taking him to the infirmary. No visitors for the time being?" Purbright nodded and stood, surveying the area. The embankment was steep, the soil loose with recent rain. Footprints marked the edge where someone had clearly struggled. A broken branch lay nearby, splintered and hanging like a crude marker. Malley bent to inspect a scuff in the dirt.
"Could have been an accident." he said doubtfully.
He might have slipped. Perhaps, Purbright murmured. Or perhaps someone ensured he did. He turned his attention to the bystanders. Mrs. Prowse stood apart, her hands clenched tightly around a handkerchief. When Purbright approached, she drew herself up with the brittle dignity of a woman determined not to cry. "Inspector," she said, her voice trembling. "My boy's no fool." If he said he was pushed, then pushed he was. "Who would do such a thing?" Purbright regarded her steadily. "That is what we must determine, Mrs. Prowse. Did Arthur leave the house early this morning?"
"Yes," she said quickly.
"He went out before breakfast. I assumed he was meeting friends, though he's been—"
"Restless lately? Secretive? I should have pressed him, but I thought it better not to pry." Her gaze flicked towards the crowd.
"Some people thrive on other folks' misfortunes, Inspector. You'll find no shortage of them here." Purbright offered a quiet word of reassurance before moving on. The crowd was already buzzing with speculation. Fragments of conversation swirling like autumn leaves. Ran into trouble over the allotment fees. That's what it was. Or maybe he knew something about the trophy and someone wanted to keep him quiet. "I heard he'd been drinking last night."
"Could have stumbled home and—" "Don't be daft. A fall like that? No, there's more to it." Among the faces, Purbright spotted Vera Dimmock whispering urgently to one of her neighbours.
When she noticed him watching, she fell abruptly silent, her expression shifting to one of exaggerated innocence. Back at the station, Purbright sat with Mally to piece together what little they knew. "Arthur was at the parish hall meeting last night," Mally said, consulting his notes. "Slipped out near the end. No one seems to know where he went afterward. Yet this morning he turns up at the foot of an embankment," Purbright mused. "Curious timing," Mally frowned. "Do you think it's connected to the cup?" "I think," Purbright said slowly, "that someone decided the business was becoming untidy. Perhaps Arthur had begun to see more than he should." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sidney Harrow entered, cap in hand, looking uneasy. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but I thought you should hear this straight away. Early this morning, before all the commotion, I saw Leonard Tewkesbury heading toward the Mill Road. Looked in a mighty hurry, he did." Purbright's eyes sharpened.
"You're certain it was Leonard?"
"Certain as I am of the taste of my own ale," Sidney replied. Didn't think much of it at the time, but now, when Sidney had gone, Mally let out a low whistle.
"Leonard near the scene."
"That's damning, sir." "Damning only if taken at face value," Purbright said. "Leonard has been an easy target from the start. I hesitate to believe in coincidences, but I am equally wary of conclusions that arrive too neatly." Later that afternoon, Purbright called at Leonard's house. Leonard opened the door looking pale and strained, his hands twisting nervously. "Inspector!" "I suppose you've heard about Arthur?" "Dreadful business. Simply dreadful." "Indeed," Purbright said evenly. "Where were you this morning, Mr. Tewkesbury?"
"At home, naturally. I overslept, you see."
"Didn't leave the house until nearly 10. Purbright's gaze was steady. "And yet someone claims to have seen you near the Mill Road earlier." Leonard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air.
"That's impossible."
"They must be mistaken."
"Why would I go there?"
"That is precisely what I am trying to understand," Purbright replied calmly. He did not press further, merely left Leonard to stew in his own panic. Outside, the sun was already sinking, the sky streaked with crimson. The peaceful view was at odds with the knot tightening in Purbright's mind. The theft of the cup had been, until now, a matter of local pride and petty rivalry. Arthur's fall changed everything. It suggested desperation, a willingness to move beyond mischief into violence. As Purbright returned to the station, he paused on the bridge over the river, watching the water slip silently beneath. The game had shifted. The players were the same, but the stakes were no longer harmless. Somewhere among the familiar faces of Flaxborough, someone had crossed an invisible line. And if Purbright did not find them soon, he feared Arthur might not be the last to fall. Inspector Purbright stood on the narrow footbridge spanning the Flax, his hands resting lightly on the cold iron rail. Below, The river moved with deceptive serenity, its surface dappled with reflections of orange and crimson as the last light of day seeped from the sky. To a casual passerby, it would have seemed an unremarkable autumn evening, the sort that came and went without notice. But Purbright was not a casual observer. He had spent a lifetime reading the stillness between ripples in people as well as water. Behind him, the town carried on its evening routines, doors closing, lamps being lit, the faint clatter of dishes from kitchens where families sat down to supper. Life in Flaxborough appeared unbroken, its rhythms reliable. Yet beneath that comforting surface, Purbright felt the churn of something darker, a disturbance as subtle as the swirling current beneath the bridge. Arthur Prowse lay in the infirmary, hovering between consciousness and fevered muttering. A boy teetering on the cusp of manhood, burdened with more secrets than his thin shoulders could bear. Purbright pictured Arthur's pale, anxious face and wondered whether the young man's fall had been an act of impulsive recklessness, or the inevitable result of forces closing in around him. Arthur's broken body was proof enough that this investigation had shifted beyond mere village theatrics. The theft of a tarnished cup now seemed like a pebble dropped into deep water, its ripples widening outward until they touched every corner of the community. He closed his eyes briefly, sorting through the tangled threads of memory and conversation. The parish hall meeting had been particularly revealing, not for what was said openly, but for the expressions that flickered and vanished like minnows darting into shadows. Mrs. Prowse's iron-clad indignation, Horace Greaves's carefully measured charm, Leonard Tewkesbury's raw defensiveness, Vera Dimmock's barbed sweetness. Each face was a mask, and each mask concealed another, older layer beneath. Purbright had long believed that crimes in small towns were rarely sudden explosions. More often, they were the slow accumulation of grievances like silt at the bottom of the river. Year by year, resentment and envy settled quietly, until one day the weight became too great and something shifted, breaking the surface with a shock that seemed, to outsiders, inexplicable. He reflected on Arthur's mysterious coat button, found so conveniently in Mrs. Prowse's trampled garden.
A clue certainly, but to what?
It could indicate Arthur's guilt, or it might have been planted with deliberate malice. Purbright could almost see the hand of someone clever enough to know the power of suggestion, leading him along a path of false certainty. In such cases, the obvious suspect was often a decoy. Leonard's name kept reappearing in whispered accusations, as though the town were eager to cast him in the role of villain. It was too convenient, too symmetrical. Sidney Harrow's report of seeing Leonard near the Mill Road might be accurate, or it might be an honest mistake shaped by expectation. Purbright had seen entire communities weave convincing narratives out of nothing more than shared prejudice. And then there was Horace Greaves, whose generosity in offering to replace the stolen cup struck Purbright as the wrong sort of magnanimity. Horace thrived on being indispensable, yet such public gestures could also serve as camouflage. If one appeared above suspicion, one could hide misdeeds in plain sight. Still, Purbright's instinct told him Horace was more frightened of scandal than capable of creating it. A frightened man could blunder into obstruction, but fear alone did not explain Arthur's fall. The river gurgled softly beneath the bridge, carrying leaves and twigs downstream. Purbright followed their progress, noting how some objects floated freely while others snagged on submerged branches. Human behavior was much the same. Certain truths glided easily into the open, while others caught on hidden obstacles, pride, shame, ambition, until they sank from view entirely. Arthur's mother loomed large in this hidden landscape. Mrs. Prowse was formidable, yes, but also deeply invested in appearances. Her garden was her fortress, her reputation her crown. If Arthur had stumbled into some scheme or quarrel that threatened that carefully cultivated image, what might she do to protect it? And how much would Arthur, in his filial devotion, conceal on her behalf. Purbright exhaled slowly, watching his breath mingle with the mist rising from the water. He had no clear answers yet, only patterns. The theft of the cup, Arthur's injury, the escalating rancour at the parish hall. These were not isolated incidents, but notes in a discordant melody. Somewhere, someone was conducting this composition, whether deliberately or merely through a series of selfish choices whose consequences had grown beyond control. He thought of the anonymous notes delivered to the station, each pointing to a different suspect. The handwriting had been careful, almost prim. The language was precise, avoiding outright lies while planting suggestions like seeds in fertile soil. It was the work of a mind attuned to manipulation. A person who understood that in a town like Flaxborough, rumour could be a weapon more potent than any physical act. The inspector's thoughts returned to Arthur, lying helpless and silent. Whatever the young man had known, or guessed, someone had decided it was dangerous enough to silence. That alone suggested a secret of considerable weight.
And yet, Purbright mused, it might not be the secret everyone assumed.
In his experience, the most destructive truths were rarely dramatic. They were small, almost laughably petty, until viewed in the light of pride and desperation. As darkness gathered, Purbright straightened and adjusted his hat. The river murmured beneath him, indifferent to the troubles of men. Tomorrow he would return to questioning, to careful observation, to the slow peeling back of masks. For now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, acknowledging the fragile balance of the town he served. Flaxborough was a place of narrow streets and narrower judgments, where ambition might wear the guise of neighbourly concern, and where the line between virtue and vanity was as thin as a single thread of mist. Purbright knew that to find the truth he would need to tread lightly. Like a man crossing the river on stepping stones, one misstep, and he too might vanish beneath the surface. With that thought, he turned and walked back toward the village lights, his silhouette merging with the shadows, the steady rhythm of his steps echoing faintly in the stillness as the river flowed on, silent witness to the hidden currents of deceit. The morning brought a brittle calm to Flaxborough, as though the town itself had decided to hold its breath. Doors opened with cautious creaks, curtains twitched, and the market square hummed with a kind of restrained anticipation. The fate-stolen trophy had been yesterday's entertainment, Arthur Prowse's fall today's whispered horror. But now there was a third element at play, a sense that something or someone was about to be exposed. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station earlier than usual, his manner outwardly unhurried, but with a sharpened edge beneath it. He spent an hour reviewing notes, revisiting conversations, and considering the many tangled motives that had surfaced over the past days. The theft, Arthur's injury, the anonymous letters. Each piece of the puzzle seemed deliberately placed, as though an unseen hand had been guiding them into position. He suspected that hand belonged not to a reckless brute, but to a person of calculation, someone who understood the town's weaknesses and had used them like threads to weave a net of suspicion. Sergeant Malley watched with mounting curiosity as Purbright drafted a brief notice and dispatched a constable to deliver copies around town. "Might I ask, sir," Malley ventured, "why you've summoned the Fête Committee to the parish hall again?"
I thought we'd had quite enough fireworks there last time. Purbright's mouth curved in the faintest of smiles.
"We have, Sergeant, which is why this meeting will be of a different sort. Sometimes, when the water is muddy, the best course is to disturb it just enough that what lies beneath reveals itself." By late afternoon, the parish hall was filled once more. The gathering had a forced cheerfulness, like a tea party where everyone suspected the sandwiches might be poisoned. Mrs. Prowse sat with her chin high. Leonard and Vera avoided one another's gaze, and Horace Greaves stationed himself near the tea urn as if guarding it were a public service. Sidney Harrow lingered by the doorway, eager for drama. Purbright entered quietly, greeted the room with polite nods, and then addressed them in a voice so mild it drew everyone closer to hear. "Thank you all for coming.
I appreciate that recent events have been unsettling."
Arthur Prowse remains in the infirmary. His condition is improving, though he is not yet able to speak clearly. There were murmurs of sympathy, some genuine, some not, Purbright continued. In the meantime, I have been piecing together what happened at the fête. The missing trophy, you will be relieved to know, has been recovered. A ripple ran through the group. Mrs. Prowse gasped audibly. Yes, Purbright said, letting the word hang. It was found early this morning beneath one of the old wooden benches behind St. Swithin's Church. Wrapped carefully in cloth, entirely undamaged. A curious hiding place, wouldn't you agree? Eyes darted from face to face. Leonard looked bewildered, Vera suspicious, Horace offended. Purbright appeared serene, though inwardly he noted each reaction with care. What struck me most, he went on, was how cleanly this was done. Whoever took the cup did so with precision and purpose. And yet, rather than destroy or discard it, they secreted it away as though intending to return it later, or to ensure it was found at exactly the right moment. Horace cleared his throat.
Inspector, are you implying some kind of
elaborate scheme? Not implying, Councillor. Simply observing. Purbright allowed himself a small, pleasant smile. And to that end I thought it only fair to invite you all here so that I might return the trophy publicly to its rightful place. From a side table, he lifted a cloth-covered object and set it on the centre table. Gasps greeted the sight of the gleaming cup. It caught the fading light streaming through the windows, a symbol of pride restored, or perhaps
of deceit revealed. Before we proceed, Purbright said,
his tone deceptively casual. I should mention one small but important detail. When the trophy was recovered, it bore traces of something unusual, oil, the kind used on fine tools or mechanisms. Not a great deal, merely a smudge. A tremor passed through the room. Mrs. Prowse frowned, Leonard blinked rapidly, and Vera's lips tightened. Horace shifted his weight, attempting to appear calm. Such oil, Purbright continued, is uncommon at a fête. There were no machines present that required it. So I must ask myself, who among us might possess such oil and why would it transfer to the trophy? He let the question drift like a baited line.
Silence spread, brittle and expectant.
Then very softly, Purbright added, it is curious, too, that Arthur Prowse was found near the old quarry. That area is seldom visited save by those with reason to be there, perhaps to meet someone in private.
Or to hide something best kept secret. Arthur's mother gave a strangled cry, half anger, half fear.
Inspector, are you accusing my boy of wrongdoing? Not at all, Mrs. Prowse. Purbright's voice was gentle. I believe Arthur stumbled upon the truth quite by accident, and that someone, fearing exposure, acted hastily to silence him. Fortunately, they failed. The tension in the hall grew palpable. Leonard's hands twitched at his sides. Vera's breathing quickened. Sidney Harrow was practically vibrating with suppressed excitement. Purbright glanced at the trophy, then back to the group. I would like to invite our chairman, Councillor Greaves, to lift the cup and place it once again in its case.
A symbolic gesture, if you will. Horace hesitated, then stepped forward with a stiff smile. Of course, Inspector.
A privilege, truly. He reached for the cup. At that precise moment, Purbright spoke again, his tone sharp, but still courteous. Ah, careful, sir. You wouldn't wish to smear more oil upon it. Horace froze. A tiny intake of breath escaped someone at the back of the hall. Purbright saw it, the flicker of guilt, swift and unmistakable, cross another face entirely. Not Horace's, but Vera Dimmock's. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with sudden panic. The room erupted in murmurs. Purbright lifted a calming hand.
Thank you, Mrs. Dimmock, he said evenly.
That was most illuminating. Vera's protest was immediate and shrill.
I don't know what you mean. This is outrageous.
On the contrary, Purbright replied, his tone smooth as silk. It is quite ordinary.
A simple test, you see. Only the guilty concern themselves with a detail no one else could possibly know. As the hall dissolved into shocked voices, Purbright stood perfectly still, his trap sprung.
The performance had been polite, the stage modest. But the result was exactly as he intended. The true culprit had revealed themselves without a single accusation uttered. The parish hall meeting did not so much conclude as disintegrate. After Vera's startled outburst, voices rose like a storm tide, questions crashing into accusations until the air seemed too thick to breathe. Purbright did not attempt to quell the uproar. Instead, he stood serenely by the table with the recovered trophy, hands loosely clasped, allowing the room to exhaust itself. The loudest protests always came from those most eager to conceal their fear. At last, when the noise ebbed into a sullen murmur, Purbright inclined his head toward Reverend Crickley, who hurriedly announced that the gathering was adjourned. People filed out in uneasy clusters, whispering fiercely, their gazes flicking back to Vera with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She herself left in a whirl of skirts, flinging a single indignant glance over her shoulder, her lips pressed into a hard line. Only when the hall had emptied did Sergeant Malley, still flushed with excitement,
burst out. Well, sir, that was brilliant.
You had her right in your net. Did you see her face? Plain as day she gave herself away. Purbright's expression remained mild.
I saw her face, yes.
But what it revealed is not yet the whole truth, Malley blinked. You mean you don't think she did it? I think, Purbright replied, that she knows far more than she wishes to admit. Guilt, however, is another matter entirely. A cornered witness can look very like a criminal. As they walked back toward the station through streets darkened by early evening, Purbright's mind ticked over the fragments he had collected. The button in Mrs. Prowse's garden, Arthur's frantic evasions, Horace's grand gestures, Leonard's public temper, Vera's polished composure cracking at last. The pieces no longer lay scattered. They were sliding into place, forming a picture that had little to do with gardens or trophies and everything to do with pride and ambition. At the station, he laid out the physical evidence on his desk. The button, the anonymous notes, even a scrap of cloth from the wrapping that had concealed the cup.
Malley hovered behind him like a schoolboy waiting for the solution to a riddle. Purbright tapped the button thoughtfully.
This was never dropped carelessly. It was left where it would be found to point us toward Arthur. Malley frowned.
But why frame the lad?
Because, Purbright said, he was dangerous to someone, not through cunning, but through naivety. Arthur overheard something, or perhaps saw it, and, not understanding its full weight, confided in the wrong person. That made him a liability, Malley scratched his head.
So the fall at the quarry wasn't an accident, precisely?
Whoever met him there intended to frighten him into silence.
Unfortunately, they pushed too hard.
Whether by accident or intent, Arthur nearly paid with his life, Malley shifted uneasily.
And Vera?
She near jumped out of her skin when you mentioned the oil. Because she recognized it, Purbright said softly. But she was not the one who applied it. Vera has her faults, vanity, sharp tongue, a taste for intrigue, but she lacks subtlety.
No, she was shocked because she realized too late what it meant.
Her reaction was useful, but not proof. He lifted one of the anonymous notes between thumb and forefinger.
Consider these.
Each accuses a different person, yet the style is identical. Precise language, neat script, deliberate ambiguity. Such care suggests not a prankster, but a planner. Someone who thrives on directing others while remaining unseen. Horace, Malley said immediately. It fits him to a T. The man's always arranging committees and schemes. Purbright shook his head. Horace values appearances above all else.
These notes are not his voice.
They are quieter, subtler, and besides, he feared scandal too much to risk drawing attention to himself. He turned the note over and tapped it gently. No, the author is someone accustomed to moving behind the scenes, guiding others with a light touch, someone who has long experience in making suggestions seem like other people's ideas. Realization dawned slowly on Mally's face. The Reverend Purbright allowed himself a brief, wry smile. Precisely. Reverend Crickley's position gives him access to everyone and everything. Confessions, secrets, grudges all flow through his hands like water through a sieve. Who would suspect the man offering spiritual guidance? Mally's mouth worked soundlessly.
But why?
Why go to all this trouble over a cup? Because the cup was never the point, Purbright said. The fête, the trophy, even the petty rivalries, they were tools. Reverend Crickley wanted to remove certain people from influence, to reshape the town according to his vision.
Arthur, poor boy, stumbled onto some fragment of that plan.
Perhaps he overheard a conversation. Perhaps he discovered the hiding place of the cup by accident. Either way, he became a threat. Mally sat heavily in a chair.
So all this, the notes, the gossip, the fall at the quarry, it's been him pulling the strings?
Purbright nodded. Indeed. And tonight's little display was meant to confirm which strings were most tangled. Vera's panic showed me she had been manipulated too. She believed herself a mere bystander, but in truth, she was being steered like the rest. He gathered the evidence into a neat stack and rose. Tomorrow we shall meet again at the parish hall. This time there will be no theatrics, no traps. I will lay out the truth plainly, with every thread connected. Mally exhaled slowly.
And the others?
Leonard, Horace, Vera? They will hear their parts in the tale, Purbright said. Some will leave chastened, others humiliated. But they will all understand at last how close they came to destroying one another for the sake of a story carefully sewn. As the night deepened outside the station windows, Purbright allowed himself a moment of stillness. Tomorrow the mask would be lifted, and the quiet game that had turned neighbour against neighbour would finally be brought into the open. And when that happened, there would be no mistaking the hand that had guided it all from the shadows. The next evening, the parish hall was lit by its usual collection of mismatched lamps, their soft glow casting uneven pools of light across the polished wooden floor. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows and whispered through the hedges, but within, the air was tense and still. The fête committee had gathered once more, their faces tight with expectation and dread. Each member sat apart from the others, wary, as though proximity itself might invite accusation. Mrs. Prowse perched stiffly on a chair near the front, her hands folded like a shield against the evening's revelations. Leonard Tewkesbury, pale and fidgeting, twisted his hat in his lap, his glance darting nervously between Vera Dimmock and Horace Greaves. Vera, for her part, sat ramrod straight, her chin lifted high, though the restless flicker of her eyes betrayed a deep unease. Horace stood near the refreshment table, attempting to appear calm and authoritative, but perspiring slightly at the temples. The Reverend Crickley moved quietly among them, offering a few murmured words of comfort, though even his usually placid expression seemed strained tonight. When Inspector Purbright entered, the murmurs fell silent. He took his place at the front of the hall, removing his hat with a deliberate calm. His manner was courteous, almost gentle, as though what he was about to say was merely housekeeping rather than the unmasking of deceit. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "I appreciate that the past week has been difficult. A theft, an injury, suspicions flying thick as autumn leaves. It has unsettled us all. Tonight, I hope we may restore a measure of clarity." He allowed a pause, letting his gaze rest briefly on each person in turn. The matter of the missing fête trophy seemed at first a simple case of mischief, but as we have all seen, it became far more serious. A young man lies in the infirmary, his life nearly lost. That cannot be dismissed as village high spirits gone awry. Mrs. Prowse let out a soft gasp, which she quickly smothered with her handkerchief. Purbright continued, his tone as even as a church bell tolling. The temptation, of course, has been to seize upon the most obvious suspect. Leonard's rivalry with Vera, Horace's prominence and access, Arthur's strange behaviour, each provided convenient explanations. And yet every time one thread was followed, it led to another more tangled, until the entire matter seemed nothing but knots. He placed a small stack of items on the table before him. The distinctive button, the folded anonymous notes, and the trophy itself. They glimmered faintly in the lamplight, silent witnesses to the drama that had unfolded. "This button," Purbright said, touching it lightly, "was found in Mrs. Prowse's garden. Its placement was deliberate. It pointed toward Arthur, suggesting his guilt. But Arthur's only crime was to stumble upon a truth he did not fully understand. Someone wished to ensure we looked at him and nowhere else." Mrs. Prowse's composure wavered. "My Arthur is no thief," she whispered fiercely. "No, madam," Purbright agreed gently.
"He is not?"
He was a pawn. He picked up the notes next. These messages, each accusing a different person, were written by the same hand. The style is unmistakable, precise, careful, exacting. They were crafted not merely to mislead, but to inflame old grievances. By setting neighbours against neighbours, the true culprit ensured that the investigation would drown in confusion. Horace shifted uncomfortably, but Purbright's gaze did not linger on him. "Consider also the oil found upon the trophy," Purbright went on. "This detail was not publicly known, yet when I mentioned it last night, Mrs. Dimmock reacted strongly. At first glance, one might think that incriminating, but her reaction was one of shock, not guilt. She recognized the significance of the oil because she had seen it before on a particular object in a particular place." Vera flushed deeply, her composure cracking.
I only realized then what must have been happening," she stammered.
"I thought it couldn't be true." "And yet," Purbright said gently, "it was." He turned slowly, his gaze finally settling on the Reverend Crickley. The clergyman's hands, folded in apparent serenity, were trembling ever so slightly. "The person who took the cup," Purbright said, his tone now soft but implacable, was not motivated by greed or even rivalry. Their purpose was more subtle, to manipulate, to shape the town's narrative. By removing the trophy, they created a vacuum, a symbol gone missing, a puzzle demanding to be solved. Into that vacuum rushed gossip, suspicion, division. It was, in effect, a test of loyalty and influence. The room held its breath. "Reverend Crickley," Purbright said at last, "you had access to every element of this scheme. You held the key to the trophy case. You heard the private confessions, the whispered grievances. You alone could plant ideas in the minds of others without drawing notice. And when Arthur overheard something he should not, perhaps a conversation, perhaps a remark, you lured him to the quarry under the guise of pastoral counsel. When he refused to keep silent, you pushed him. Perhaps you meant only to frighten him. Perhaps—" A sound escaped Vera, half sob, half cry. Horace staggered back a step, his mouth opening and closing. Leonard muttered something unintelligible, clutching his hat like a lifeline. Reverend Crickley's face remained eerily calm. "Inspector," he said, his voice low and smooth, "this is an extraordinary accusation. My entire life has been devoted to service. You cannot seriously expect these people to believe such a vile charge." Purbright inclined his head slightly.
"I do not expect them to believe me on faith, Reverend. That would be ironic, would it not? No, I expect them to consider the evidence."
Arthur spoke one clear word before he slipped into unconsciousness. "Shepherd." At first, I thought it a rambling reference to the Psalms, but then I realized he meant it quite literally. A shepherd guides the flock, unseen, shaping their movements. And who among us is more of a shepherd than you? Crickley's mask faltered at last. His lips thinned, his nostrils flared. The boy was confused, he said sharply. Delirious, Perhaps, Purbright allowed. But when we searched your study this morning, we found a small bottle of oil, the same kind used to maintain the old hymn book stands in St. Swithin's oil.
Identical to that found on the trophy, a gasp rippled.
Through the hall, Purbright's voice was quiet now, almost pitying. You sought to shape this town according to your vision. A theft here, a whisper there, nudging people as gently as one might guide sheep. But ambition, like faith, can curdle when taken to extremes. You believed you were preserving harmony.
In truth, you were destroying it. For a long moment, no one moved.
Then Mrs. Prowse rose to her feet, her face pale but resolute. "You hurt my boy," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Whatever your reasons, you hurt him." Quickly opened his mouth, but no words came. The strength seemed to drain from him. Shoulders sagging, he sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. Purbright signalled to Mally, who stepped forward to escort the Reverend away. The crowd remained frozen, their shock so complete that even Horace found no words of consolation or leadership. When the hall was nearly empty, Purbright stood alone beside the table. He glanced at the restored trophy, its polished surface reflecting the lamplight. It looked so innocuous now, so laughably small compared to the storm it had caused. As he replaced his hat, he murmured, almost to himself, "Small things, Sergeant, can tip the balance of entire worlds." Outside, the wind carried his words away into the night, leaving the parish hall quiet at last. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.